I want to welcome you to this study in the book of Galatians. Thank you for joining us today. You know, at the end of this video, you're going to see our web address. I would ask that you would pray about supporting this ministry and becoming a partner with this ministry. This ministry is brought to you and brought to people around the world. We got people all around the world that are listening to these videos. They have to speak English, of course, but a lot of the world does already. But we bring these to you free of charge. We don't charge you to join us, but we do need your partnership. We need you to come, and we need you to partner with us in prayer. We need you to partner with us financially. So at the end of this video, you're going to see our web address. And then you're going to see a couple buttons on our first web page. One of them is going to be to subscribe to our email newsletter. You can hit that button and subscribe to our email newsletter. But then there's a give button. Hit the give button and give as the Holy Spirit shows you to give. Will you do that for us? We would surely appreciate that. Now today, we're in Galatians, the 4th chapter. We're in verse number 24. Now the Apostle Paul is speaking allegorically. Now, in fact, he says that. Let's go ahead and read just the first part of verse number 24. He says, "I am speaking allegorically." Now, what is an allegory? Well, if you're a reader of great literature, C.S. Lewis wrote allegories. Not just allegories, but he wrote books like the Screwtape Letters. He wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. Both of those books should be read by believers. I mean, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader blessed me when I read it many, many, many years ago. An amazing book, but it's an allegory. Those are not real characters, but it's a story to bring about a meaning or a purpose. Now here, the Apostle Paul says, I'm speaking allegorically, but he's actually speaking about historical people. But he's speaking about them for the purpose of teaching us something. And what the Apostle Paul is teaching the Galatians and us is that there are two covenants. Two covenants. One was a covenant that was based upon the law and the keeping of the law. Then another covenant was a covenant of promise. So let's take a look at what he says, going back to verse number 24. And he says, I am speaking allegorically for these women. Now, who are the women? He's talking about Hagar and Sarah. For these women are two covenants. They're two covenants. They represent two different covenants. One coming from Mount Sinai, giving birth to the children who are to be slaves. Now, where did the first covenant come from? The first covenant came, not the first in chronological order. Actually, the first covenant chronologically came with Abraham, and it was a covenant of promise. But the first one that we're looking at, I should put it that way, it came from Mount Sinai. Well, what happened at Mount Sinai? For those of you who are lacking in Old Testament knowledge, Mount Sinai was the place that Moses went up and received the law of God. He received the 10 Commandments on tablets of stone. A powerful, powerful time. I mean, the children of Israel looked at Mount Sinai and they were in fear and trembling. They thought Moses went up there, and because of the length of time that Moses was up there, they thought he was dead. They thought God killed him. And so they went and they began to worship a golden calf. But Mount Sinai was a powerful, powerful time. But it was on Mount Sinai that the children of Israel received the law. Now notice how the Apostle Paul describes this covenant. He says, one coming from Mount Sinai, giving birth to children who are to be slaves. slaves. What was the purpose of Mount Sinai? What was the purpose of the Old Covenant? It was to show people their slavery. When you say, well, what do you mean by that? You see, sin came into the world with Adam and Eve. But there was no designation of what sin was until Mount Sinai. And then all of a sudden, God is saying, this is what sin is. And you know what? What God was doing is he was waking up the children of Israel. He was teaching them that they were slaves to sin, that they were in bondage, not only to the law, but they were in bondage to sin itself. And so the first covenant was a covenant that showed to the people their bondage. We talked about how the law is a tutor that brings us to Christ, how the law has a purpose of showing us what sin is. And that's exactly what happened on Mount Sinai. But now let's go back to verse number 24 again. And he says, she is Hagar. In other words, he describes who this woman is. This woman is Hagar. She is the mother of Ishmael. Ishmael was born according to the flesh. We talked about that, I believe, yesterday or the day before. And then he goes on to verse number 25. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is enslaved with her children. Now, what is the Apostle Paul talking about? He's saying Mount Sinai, slavery. But he's also saying it corresponds with. And this word corresponds means it relates to, it walks alongside of, it corresponds with present day Jerusalem. What's he talking about? He's talking about the people in Jerusalem who are under the law. And then he says at the end of verse number 25, for she is enslaved with her children. Who's he talking about? He's talking about present day Jerusalem. And he's talking about how Jerusalem at that time, and I don't believe he's talking about the believers in Jerusalem, but he's talking about Jerusalem. And he's saying the Jewish people, they're in slavery. They're in the same slavery that Hagar was involved in. They're slaves. So we understand that this first covenant that we talked about today was a covenant of slavery. Join us again tomorrow as we continue our study of the book of Galatians.